Okay, I think we started recording, and I just wanted to. Hello, everyone. I'm Luis Pessoa, and we're having here meeting of a salon, the philosophy and the neuroscience and philosophy salon, where we get together to discuss conceptual issues at the interface between neuroscience and conceptual thinking, conceptual work, and before I get started here, I just want to plug in this new society for philosophy and neuroscience that you can check out and get lots of interesting events. And there's a conference that is held every other year that is going to be probably the next one in April or May of 2026. So keep an eye for that. So it's a new society that for those of you who are also interested in these issues more generally, not just specific to language, please check it out. It's philandneuro.com. Okay, so let me introduce today's event. So what we're doing today, we're gathered to discuss language in the brain, which is quite something overwhelming for me, because if you ask what is the area of cognitive science, psychology, and neuroscience that I know the least, that's probably the area that I know the least. But so I hope to, with you, learn quite a lot today. So Elliot Murphy from the University of Texas Medical School, Houston, is going to get us started and present his views and his architecture, his neuroarchitecture, his model of syntax and learning, and how that uniquely human capability maps to the brain, the human brain. And we are going to have, after this initial presentation, we're going to have brief commentaries by William Matchin from the University of South Carolina. And we'll choose the order once we get there, but it can be whatever order we feel is more appropriate. And Sander van Bree is going to, who is from, I should have asked, Sander, can you remind us your current affiliation? I just wanted to make sure we got this right.
Yeah, I'm at the University of Giessen in Germany, postdoc.
Yeah, that's what I thought. The university is called Justus Liebig, or the university. Yeah, and so Sander van Bree and William Matchin are going to discuss very briefly for a few minutes each, and then we're going to open the discussion to everyone, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion on Elliot's presentation. So Elliot, let me, I'm going to stop sharing, and you can start your presentation. Yes, I can see it here. So yeah, take it away.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. You guys can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can see it. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, thank you very much, Louis, for that introduction. I'm going to be talking today about language in the brain. I'm going to be giving more of a kind of a conceptual overview of some of the things that I've been thinking about. I'm going to be starting by talking about large language models, kind of critiquing them as an apparatus for understanding language in the brain, and then moving more concretely into like exploring more specific issues about how language might be neurally encoded. And then I'm going to bring it back at the end to large language models to kind of wrap things up. Okay, so to introduce, in fact, let me just minimize this screen so I can see what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to argue that there's the very diverse causal landscape in the brain, and different aspects of this landscape can explain different aspects of language, like phonology, semantics, and grammar. Large language models can capture statistical regularities from the fossilized output of human language like text, but they don't do a good job of inferring deep syntactic structures like the human brain does. That's the kind of basic premise of what I'm going to be arguing today. Okay, large language models, or large corpus models, as I think they should be called. There's a lot of research showing that the LLM brain alignments in the literature are driven by fragile methodologies and overlooked confounds. I'm just going to go really quick on this section. Hopefully only going to be spending maybe 10-15 minutes just to get through to the meat of the presentation. A lot of recent work showing that transformers don't represent sentence meaning in a manner akin to the human brain. LLMs don't reliably distinguish between grammatical and ungrammatical structures. So-called large reasoning models seem to engage rather in sophisticated pattern matching. This is a research from Apple. Leading large language models don't show reliable sensitivity to the meaning structure distinction, which is the distinction between the meaning of a phrase or a sentence and the way that it happens to be configured, which is the core distinction that humans are sensitive to. ChatGPT doesn't capture fundamental principles of linguistic structure, like sensitivity to phrase structure. LLMs don't capture more sophisticated higher order aspects of syntax as well. And they also have a strong linearity bias and don't capture deep syntactic structures. So I'll return to what that means later. But a recent review paper from Jean-Marie King and colleagues reviews the successes and remaining challenges of large language models with respect to syntax. And the remaining challenges that they document are effectively all of human-specific syntactic knowledge. Large language models also do not predict brain activation in language areas any better than non-language areas. And this exclusive focus on statistics and surprisal serves to obscure mechanisms, psychological and neural, that explain behavioral and neural responses for language. Right? So structure is not the same thing as statistics, and this is a core, very, very simple idea, extremely simple, but it's kind of overlooked, I think, a lot in the LLM and neuroscience literature, whereby the statistics of language is certainly important and used to cue the underlying representation that you're trying to arrive at, but the structural features of language cannot be exhaustively explained through statistical features, and that's been known for quite a long time. These critiques also apply to some extent to the text-to-image domain as well. So, models like DALL-E, we've done some work showing that DALL-E doesn't do a very good job representing compositional meaning, where the meaning of the phrase kind of goes beyond the individual parts. If you just arrange the meaning of the individual words into kind of a semantic blender, you'll kind of output the kinds of images that DALL-E does, but you won't respect the configuration, the meaning of the configuration. Same true also for the most recent DALL-E 3 image, where it fails to represent things like negation, prepositional phrases, reversible transitives. It kind of performs a trance of all these structures. It just takes the words in the prompt that you're giving it, throws it around into a blender, and then spits out something that kind of looks more or less appropriate. And this also applies all the way back in the ancient days of 2022, where you ask Crayon, which is the predecessor to DALL-E Mini, very simple prompts. You ask for it to depict a wedding photo with absolutely no Shrek, and it gives you this. Also true for even the most recent model, GPT-5, which of course is claimed to do advanced reasoning and thinking. If you ask it to depict, every street lamp is lit except 3, kind of basic syntactic instructions there, it doesn't do very well. It also can't represent precise numerosities. If you say draw 23 bananas, it'll draw like 18 or 19. Also fails to depict the correct spelling and circling the correct letters on this prompt, where I say draw the word nevertheless and target specific elements of this word. So yeah, 60% of the time it works every time, to quote Paul Rudd in Anchorman. Also a quick lesson here from a theme that's going to come back later about acquisition and the universality of this system that I'm going to be proposing. There's a recent ongoing challenge called the Baby LLM challenge that a lot of you people will probably know about. When these language models are limited to ecologically valid amounts of data, so the kind of amount of data that kids get when they're learning language, as opposed to the entire internet, they often fail to impose the correct rules for language. Okay, so let's think a little bit more about the logical relations that I'm trying to eschew here. We know about valid forms of logic like modus ponens and modus tollens. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q, and so on and so on. But people like Guest and Martin have noticed that a lot of the ways that people in the literature align large language models' performance to neural data is guilty of a classic problem in philosophy, affirming the consequent. Oh dear, this is not good. For it's common in the literature to confuse types of inference, misunderstand the evidentiary role that correlation plays, and of course offer no formalized thought on the relationship between model and observation. So for example, if I say, if I am Beyonce, then I am fabulous. Statement 2, I am fabulous, so therefore I am Beyonce. right? That's clearly very poor logic. But this is the type of logic that you get in the literature quite commonly. So you often hear things like, this LLM output has human-like qualities to it. Therefore, it gives us certain specific implications for theories of human cognition. But nobody, of course, would argue that AlphaGo is a plausible model of human strategizing, as far as I know, or that Cicero is a plausible model of human theory of mind. So why would an LLM be a model of human language exactly? Not sure. A scientist or model may be able to classify, describe, and predict very well. And this touches on some of Sander's work, actually, in philosophy of science, all without providing causal explanations of a system. So due to LLMs being a universal approximation method, they are more akin to tools such as generalized Fourier series than scientific theories. But there's many curious, shadowy syllogisms and logical statements and quasi-causal claims in the cognitive neuroscience of language literature that don't actually obtain, but they're kind of disguised rhetorically as complex mechanistic insights. This is a critique that's been raised by a number of people in the last few years, but it goes back to ideas from Russell. So I thought, okay, I'm going to ask ChatGPT, do you think neuroscientists should use LLMs as genuine theories of language? And when I did this, I logged out of my ChatGPT account and I created a guest account just so it didn't have all the history of me, bullying large language models and critiquing it and so on. So it's completely neutral. Do you think neuroscientists should use LLMs as genuine theories of language? And it said, no, that's a really bad idea. Don't do that. And here's why. LLMs are not theories. They are function approximators, as I said. They lack cognitive plausibility, for sure. This is a crucial point that I'm going to get back to. The main point I'm going to talk about later. They obscure rather than clarify causal neural mechanisms. This is a real serious problem that most people in the literature that I've spoken to who are more on the other side of the fence kind of know and they're kind of aware of, but their response always seems to be, well, we got to find out, which features of these models, do correlate with the brain, and then these things will become clear later. And that's I'm not really convinced by that logic. They also bypass theoretical linguistics, which for a lot of people is a good thing, but not for me. Okay, so modeling linguistic semantics via vector spaces will only get us so far. Language interfaces with various conceptual domains with their own unique formats. Some of these are digital, logical, others are analog, continuous. So I can say John walked proudly down the street after he got his paper accepted. Proudly can denote multiple types of meanings at once, right? It's kind of a spatial instruction. There's a kind of sociological, pragmatic meaning to it. There's an emotional component. And crucially, many of these, let's just take an example from people like Paul Petrovsky, who's a very good semanticist. He kind of sees language as providing instructions to conceptual systems. That's what it does. Whenever you do language, internally or externally, you're providing instructions to conceptual systems. And these instructions can simultaneously trigger multiple, what Liz Spelke would call core knowledge systems, right? So you can make inferences and reasoning about events, theory of mind, facts, the purpose and force of certain concepts and their origin, causal structures, spatial structure, et cetera, et cetera. And you can do this within individual words, not full sentences. So vector space semantics that treat lexical meanings as points in a continuous uniform space would maybe be suitable for things like, king versus queen. Yeah. King is like queen, minus female plus male or something like that, right? But even that's kind of technically accurate, I guess, but it glosses over some certain important differences. But semantics is in reality highly typed and heterogeneous. So here's a sentence that I used in my PhD thesis about 6 or 7 years ago. The progressive school next to the river was high in the New York Times rankings and had just hired a new chancellor after being repainted. So what on earth are we talking about when we talk about that? What are we referring to when we refer to this school? What kind of object? What kind of property? What kind of metaphysics are we committed to, if any? What kind of conceptual structure are we triggering? Unclear, right? Very unclear. But it makes sense. It's a totally fine sentence. It's a good structure to trigger using your language system. But this single word can call upon diverse and categorically incompatible features. That's a really important point. There's nothing in the world that can simultaneously be a physical object and a piece of information or an event, right? These domains are not dimensions in the embedding sense. They host different mathematical structures and implicate different neural substrates. That's an important point too. LLM embeddings collapse these sensors into a blended vector. Even contextual embeddings often smear them to an extent because they lack an explicit type system to separate senses. And of course, again, this has been said before, but I'm saying it again, distances in vector space often reflect corpus frequency artifacts rather than genuine bona fide conceptual categories. This also applies for things like entailment. You can say every dog barked. That entails that some dog barked, but doesn't work the other way around. But these distributional vectors would place every and some close together because they co-occur with the same kinds of nouns and verbs. This is also a major point of contention between me and my good friend Stephen Piantadosi. So he believes that vector approaches risk, well, I believe, I'm sorry, that vector approaches risk conflating the implementation medium with the computational level. So how does a vector-based learner discover abstract exceptionalist rules without relying on statistical accident, right? The claim from my colleague Piantadosi is that, well, this is just part of the domain general learning mechanism, right? It happens so rapidly and reflexively. But the important thing about language is that we do learn exceptionalist rules of language, right? Every child necessarily arrives at the exact same notion of phrase, notion of object, notion of structure, right? There's not varying notions here. Syntactic rules do seem to be universal. So I think Piantadosi risks explaining compositionality post hoc, right? Kind of emerges in the geometry rather than as a necessary design property. And that's what we really need, especially for the universality aspect that I'll talk about later, right? It's not an accident that every child arrives at the exact same language structure. And I talked to Stephen about this a few years ago, if you want to look at that quasi mini debate that we had. Also, Gary Marcus has pointed out recently in a number of places that most of these large language models these days basically are neurosymbolic and hybrid anyway, right? So ChatGPT 5 kind of smuggles in all these different Python interpreters, code interpreters. Of course, they have guardrails, right? Which are almost definitely symbolic. So none of these systems these days actually rely purely on deep learning, right? And that's the big problem for people like Jeff Hinton. In fact, GPT-2 was probably the last pure large language model. All the large language models since have not really been large language models, right? They've been, first of all, large corpus models. Secondly, they haven't been purely connectionist. There's an excellent essay by Gary about this. So in the study of semantics, we've moved from this framework, Paul Petrosky's excellent work looking at the two basic algebraic structures that allow you to elaborate almost all of basic linguistic meanings. We move from this these days to this, and this is considered a serious advance, and I don't think it is. Right. Okay. So I've argued that large language models can't capture deep syntactic structures. So then maybe we should turn to the OG language model, right? The original language model, the human brain. So let's see what's going on there. Okay, so this section I'm going to talk about what language is, right? I've talked about what language isn't, but now I'm going to talk a little bit about what language is. But first, just to echo some points that have been made on this channel and on people who've been on this channel before. 2 quick lessons from the neural correlates of consciousness. Correlating neural activity does not equal explanation. Of course, we kind of take that for granted. But also bad metaphysics gives you bad science, right? If your theory and assumptions about the nature of these objects is wrong and not cashed out or not well thought out, then all the experimental empirical stuff that you try to derive from that is probably going to be not all that good either. So here's a good point from Mark Soames, South African neuropsychologist that many of you will know about. He's pointed out that consciousness is fundamentally an affective state, right? It feels like something. Perceptual report is an important part of consciousness, right? Vision, smell, touch, all these different sensation components to it. But therefore, any neuroscientific body of work that forms its understanding of human consciousness just through looking at visual processing or auditory processing or whatever is not potentially not going to be elaborating on the full nature, neural dynamics of consciousness, right? Because it's going to be through perceptual report. And a similar critique I'm going to levy towards the language literature later on. So, okay, so what is language? Well, it's at least the ability to put 2 things together, right? If you can't put 2 things together, you're really in trouble. You got to at least do that. Take 2 objects, put them together, categorize it into some kind of set, and then do it again. So, for example, this is done in an asymmetric way. So, quick point here: music, mathematics tolerate symmetry very well. human language does not tolerate symmetry, doesn't like it. It's like a symmetry breaking algorithm, right? When you put two things together, if you put like red together with boat, what is a red boat? A red boat is a boat that is red, right? A red boat is not a red-like quality that hosts boat-like features or whatever, right? It's boat, that's the head of the phrase, and red modifies it, right? Boat does not modify red. Same with eat cheesecake, right? Or John ran. If you say John ran, that doesn't mean that there's a special kind of John who exhibits running features. It means that there's an event of running, and John just happened to be its participant, right? So human language likes to put things together, and then once it's done that, basically there's a competition, right? Whenever two things are put together, one of them wins, right? And the winner decides the category of the phrase. And then the category of the phrase determines its distributional features. But in order to get to the distributional features, you have to put two things together, right? And this is something that humans do, but it's not something that large language models do. Hence, I think the differences. Hence why large language models are really good at capturing the statistical components of language, but they're not very good at the structural components. So algebraic models from linguistic theory provide hints at what the neural code for syntax might look like. Not necessarily, right? Not necessarily at all. But I think using these algebraic components helps you narrow down on possible candidate mechanisms. So we may be looking for mechanisms that respect non-associativity, right? Where old men and women can mean old men and women, where the women are young, or it can mean old men and women, where both the men and women are old, right? So syntactic knowledge boils down to, just to use some fancy terminology here, a non-associative commutative magma from category theory that generates non-planar trees interfacing with distinct cognitive systems. I'll elaborate on that a little bit later, providing instructions to them again. So Chomsky has argued for a long time for formalizations of this merge process to be couched within set theory, but it turns out sets are too unstructured, right? Any two things can be a set. It's hard to kind of really provide structure, more informative structure for language just using set theory. And so a lot of recent work has kind of moved beyond set theory, at least naive set theory. Mathematicians don't really like set theory. It's not very helpful. And they use category theory and other more structured formalisms to provide new avenues to formally map syntax to possible neural geometries. Again, I keep saying I'll get back to this later, but I will get back to this later. So here's another quick example. Operations in language are subject to structural configurations, not linear sequential distance. So a classic example from Chomsky is something like, the boy who's holding the flower is happy. If you ask a question, you have to say, is the boy who is holding the flower is happy, right? You don't move the linearly closest or linearly first question word to the front, right? So if you scan the sentence left to right, the first word you come across is after who, but you can't move that one. You have to respect the phrasal and structural integrity of the embedded phrase, right? Like I said, the brain kind of respects the psychological status of that phrase structure. It doesn't just, provide an operation after the nth word in a sentence, right? The fifth word or the fourth word or whatever happens to be first in linear distance. The classic example, but of this very simple example is basically the entirety of modern linguistics. That's where it comes from, right? Like this organizational principle where linguistics is about configuration. And then here's a figure from this paper that I'm presenting today. Some little hints and previews about where I'm going to be associating different components of my Rose model to various aspects of language. But language has a lexicon, right? Stored units, stored objects, representations. You put them together, you categorize it, and you can do two things. You can either linearize it, which is a thing I won't be focusing on today, but people like William Matchin have spoken about this quite a lot in some really good work. But I'm going to be leaving that aside mostly. The other thing you can do with language once you've built a structure is just to internalize it, right? You at least have to do that. In fact, you do that every time necessarily. And then you ship this structure off to different conceptual systems and they interpret them differently. So different languages will express the concept of the whiskey bottle in different ways, right? They'll order the words differently. The words will be put in different morphophonological spaces. But the concept, I assume that Japanese people and Korean people have the same concept of a whiskey bottle that I do, right? They just say it differently, right? So the conceptual apparatus is presumably the same, but the linearized space, the morphophonological space is different. In fact, a lot of linguists think that all of differences between human languages, all the thousands of languages on the planet, there are some linguists, that, including me, who think that all the differences basically just boil down to morphophonological variation, right? The syntactic and semantic kind of components are essentially universal. There's another interesting point here about the fact that this merge process is basically all or nothing. There's no such thing as half merge, right? You can't have like half a merge process. In fact, there's no mathematically plausible incremental story here. So people like Baric and Chomsky have argued this, right? In fact, even in a recent discussion with Steven Pinker and Richard Dawkins, who are both kind of arch neo-Darwinian synthesis people, right? Even Dawkins, in his memoir a few years ago, actually, and in this video, he pushes back against Steven Pinker and says, well, no, I kind of don't really see any other option. If you have a recursive grammar, digital infinity, how do you get that incrementally, right? How is a gradualist perspective from evolution compatible with that, right? You go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then infinity. And I think Dawkins has some really good points here, actually. And when he puts them to Steven Pinker, I think he does it quite convincingly. Now, having said that, there is some gradualism allowed in other aspects of language, right? So the way that we actually compose things together, we can have, so this is a system from Luigi Rizzi, different type systems for merging. You can merge the boy, so 2 items together. You can merge an item with a phrase, and you can merge a phrase with a phrase, right? So human beings, adults, have free merge systems. Children don't. Monkeys don't either. So the word phrase distinction requires a workspace to store the phrasal unit in, right, before you merge it with the word. Whereas the word structures don't, right? You just put 2 things together and then you're done, you're finished, right? And the phrase binding that human beings do with things like the man saw the boy, which is a complex syntactic object. This requires either multiple workspaces or at least the ability to do these phrasal processes kind of in parallel in your head, right, whilst you assemble the meaning. But the point is, there's at least some kind of, gradual system of workspace complexity required here. And you can see this over the course of child language acquisition. Okay, yeah. Okay, so what is mathematics again? Just wildly changing topics here, just for a minute, if that's okay. Mathematics is a study of numbers? No. Platonic entities and realms? No. Collections of formulas? No. Abstract structures? Yes. And human language is one of the most interesting abstract structures in nature, right? Easily. So what we're looking for are candidate neural mechanisms that respect set grouping. They demonstrate sensitivity to this type system that I mentioned earlier. They reflect this asymmetric nature of phrase composition, as I said. They can do this recursively, and they're also sensitive to relations between words in a sentence, right? So words often have certain relations and dependencies between them. So the way I've formalized and defined the language network here is through a core system of symbolic processes, like establishing the head of a phrase, node structure, establishing dependencies, accessing proprietary units of the system. And then all the sub-symbolic features below are what large language models are really good at, right? So all this stuff to do with estimating length, surprisals, entropy, perplexity. This is what the statistical learning part of our brain does very, very well. But then we also have to arrive at these statistically kind of independent processes. And that's what I would define the core language network as. And this is a little bit different from the way a lot of people in literature define the language network, whereby they define it as whatever regions are involved in sentences over lists of words. That's the core contrast. You get sentences, and then you get lists of random words that are not structured. And then you say, well, that's the language network. The problem there is that when you do sentence processing, you also do a lot of things that you do beside language, right? World knowledge, situation model construction, attention, memory, all these things, right? When you process a sentence, you are not just doing language. So I think this is a more kind of principled and formal, explicit definition of what the language network is. So this system that I've mentioned, building on Chomsky's work, permits a kind of information coarse graining, right? So reformatting concepts and giving us new kinds of things to think about. So language evolution, as I said, didn't just make it easier to communicate, it also therefore made it easier to think. Because this system gives us more precise coordinates in conceptual space, right? Instead of just saying, he's happy, it's like those 2 old Italian men are happy. That's a much more precise semantic object. But in the literature, we often read stroke patients have substantial language deficits, but they can still think. Therefore, language cannot be considered a thought system. Well, that's flawed causal logic and a category error. Inferring that language is not a thought system because non-linguistic thought survives after damage to language areas is like saying vision is not a sensory system because blind people can still smell, right? That's obviously not a very good argument. And I've written some papers about this where the formal structure of language is excellent for generating complex semantic inferences, but it's not very good for efficiently and clearly communicating ideas. And indeed, the vast majority of our everyday use of language is not for communication, but for things like organization of thought, planning, talking to yourself, strategizing, planning, gossiping, right? Consolidating experience, reflecting on personal responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So even if non-verbal reasoning remains, language facilitates certain higher order processes like inductive definitions, counterfactual reasoning, complex planning, and so on. So in our lab here in Houston, Texas, we use intracranial recordings to explore some of these questions in a bit more detail, where these are patients who have epilepsy and they're medically not responsive to the treatment. So they come in and they have electrodes implanted in their brain to assess and try and suss out where the epilepsy seizure onset zones are coming from. And when they're in the epilepsy monitoring unit, these patients also, some of them consent to doing some language tests. And we use that to kind of figure out the neural dynamics of where language is, okay? So, for example, I've already mentioned that language allows us to construct phrases, right, using this merge process. So these next few slides, I'm not going to give you any super technical details, just the main conceptual kind of overview and results. You can read the papers for more details. But long story short, we've basically found there's a narrow portion of tissue in the ventral bank of the posterior superior temporal sulcus that seems to care a little bit more about phrases than it does word meaning, right? So the meaning of individual words versus the meaning of a phrase. It's a slightly different type of meaning. And we do this using all sorts of, sophisticated materials to kind of contrast the meaning of a phrase to the meaning of something that is also has two elements, but is not a phrase, by using pseudo words. We've also replicated this for not just nouns and adjectives, but also for pronouns and verbs. Same kind of region comes online, and then later frontal region in the brain, IFS, becomes active. And the main story from these results is that the earliest and first part of the brain that becomes responsive to different types of higher order language structure is posterior temporal cortex, and then later frontal cortex. And that kind of, we think, resolves a long-standing debate in the literature that William has also published on extensively about frontal versus temporal contributions to higher order language. What are those contributions? Are they the same? Are they different? Are they resolved in the same time window? That's kind of the goal here. So this is an example patient who did this task where they had to listen to pseudo-word verb like blog ran, or pronoun verb like she ran, or pronoun verb violation like she rans or whatever. Some kind of morphological violation on the verb. And these are the traces of broadband high gamma activity, high frequency gamma activity that respond to these particular moments of interest. We also had a case, there was a brain tumor patient in the OR who was having this tumor outlined in purple on the brain resected. And whilst he was in the OR, we did this task where we had him play some music using a keyboard and basically comprehend music and comprehend language, and then repeat music and repeat language, right? Repetition tasks. So here's a sentence, listen to it and repeat it. Here's a melody, repeat it. And what we did is we first of all isolated music from language sites here. So nice kind of rough generalizations here for where music and language were responsive to. And then we looked more specifically at the structural features of the stimuli. So whether it was a more complex syntactic structure or a less complex one, and a more complex melody or a less complex one, right? Defined in all sorts of ways that I've mentioned here to do with levels of complexity, algorithmic complexity for the melody. And the sites that are sensitive to syntactic complexity are in blue, and the site that's responsible for engaged for musical complexity is in red. So you see this general region again, though we did have coverage in frontal cortex, by the way, a little bit in posterior IFG. It was only the posterior temporal cortex that showed sensitivity. And then we did some cortical stimulation map. Well, not me, but the neurosurgeon, Dr. Tandon, did some cortical stimulation mapping to try and see if stimulating certain parts of the brain would prevent the patient from doing these functions. And yes, indeed, it turns out that language and music were both disrupted by stimulating these parts of the brain. Another quick overview of a paper where we looked at very broad types of semantic composition in the brain to do with when you process a sentence, you do all sorts of different semantic processes. You don't just get the meaning of the words, you get the meaning of the phrase, you get the general semantic coherence of it. There's all sorts of different processes that you do alongside just word processing. And we kind of isolated different portions of cortex to be determinately involved in these processes. And then you might say, well, hang on, this is a lot of auditory processing. What about orthographic? We also replicated the effects of posterior temporal cortex for orthographic stimuli. So this is a similar kind of paradigm with minimal phrases. Again, I won't go into the details, but long story short, basic phrases using orthographic stimuli. We showed this posterior temporal cortex was involved earliest during the inference that the phrase was likely a syntactic object versus just a list of words or a phrase that had a violation. This is also important for reasons that William has talked about quite a lot too, concerning potential therapeutic advancements, right? And kind of translational work. I'll just make a quick point here. Aphasia is, wildly common in the United States and the United Kingdom and across the world. It's more common than Parkinson's and MS combined. And self-reported quality of life in aphasia is lower than cancer and Alzheimer's disease. Right? So trying to figure out the neural correlates and the causal nature of human language can potentially contribute to, brain-computer interface devices and other sorts of rehabilitative solutions. So for this final section of the talk, I'll just quickly go into my actual model, what I'm actually proposing. And I'll be echoing some points that people like Lauren Ross have made recently about the nature of neural mechanisms and what we can and cannot say about them. So neural mechanisms can have causal and explanatory power, but there's also causal structures that are not classically mechanistic. So things like cascades and pathways and topological structures that are arguably causal or non-causal, which I'll talk about in the next couple of slides. But most high impact factor journals will state their aim is to publish mechanistic insights, right? So many journals, many journal editors are unable to explain what exactly a neural mechanism is when asked. Funding agencies also request mechanistic contributions. But the point I'm making here is that if large language models mostly obscure insights into neural mechanisms, which I think they do, then where do we go, right? Where do we turn to? So here's some example explanatory structures in neuroscience, right? There's mechanisms, which can be kind of narrow or broad, right? Like local versus network level, circuit level mechanisms, some kind of conceived often as like a clockwork with parts, wholes, and interacting dynamics. Again, I'm echoing Lauren Ross's paper here. There's also pathways, which are kind of conceived as a highway. There's circuits, which are conceived as like wiring diagrams, right? There's cascades that are conceived as like a snowball effect. And then there's topological structures, right? That kind of, you can think of as like a landscape. So we have thalamic ring attractors and entorhinal cortex toroids and things like that. And these are typically abstracted away from temporality. So these are some candidates that we can use and try and figure out which properties of human language can maybe be derived and explained using any of these explanatory structures. Okay, I'll skip over this part, but this is just about what we assume causality to be. So we need a method to migrate the concepts of linguistic theory into a testable framework. And of course, it's been noted before that observable output behavior, like language, greatly underdetermines the network implementation, right? Points made by Conrad Cording and others as well. So in these papers that I'm going to be mentioning, 2024 paper in Journal of Neurolinguistics and this 2025 paper in Cognitive Neuroscience and this book that came out in 2020, I kind of, and also this, if you guys are interested in a more detailed overview, there's a very long 3-hour video on YouTube where I overview the Rose model in obnoxious levels of detail. But the general background assumption is that there is an emerging consensus that complex behavior and cognition rely on coordinated interactions between brain regions. But unlike for models of attention and working memory, there's a paucity, there's a poverty, there's an absence, there's a lack. There is a need for these oscillatory phase codes in models of natural language, right? They don't really exist in the literature. Most of human language neuroscience research is still kind of quasi-localizationist, right? Where there's kind of a gross complex process being attributed to a specific brain region. But so reliable signatures of syntax tend to be found in the low frequency range in the MEG and ECOG literature, whereas reliable signatures of semantics and lexical processing are rapidly found in higher frequencies, also low frequencies too. But there's a general tension in the literature here to do with where these signatures of syntax tend to be most reliably found and where they're not found. And that's what this Rose model tries to do. So representations, I assume, are just atomic units, conceptual units, right? Like animate features, person features, things like that. These are encoded at the single unit level, and they're composed into manipulable objects at the O level, which is represented in high gamma activity. And through things like spike phase coupling, you get this relationship between gamma phase and spiking activity. which drives the coordination of these lower level features into a coherent object, but just an object at this stage, right? Just a single conceptual feature, like, red versus bow or some kind of morphological object. And then in the operation level, you have this high frequency gamma activity, which is basically involved in sensory-motor transformations, right? And it bounds these representations into complex feature bundles that are then accessible to this higher order level. And that's where phase amplitude coupling comes in, where gamma is, of course, the amplitude that's being coupled by lower frequency phase. And then through cross-frequency coupling, you're able to synchronize and generate recursive categorical inferences through this recursive application of phase amplitude coupling with different lower level features. Again, this is all rhetorically very vague. I'll give you some more specific examples in a second. And then these complexes, these low frequency complexes, can also travel and migrate across cortex, as in fact they've been shown to do in many papers over the last 5 or 6 years. And based on empirical research in the literature, I kind of distinguish hierarchical forms of memory, storing phrasal information, from lexical memory, right? So lexical features, lexical processing, word lists, and so on, very much engaged with theta gamma processing. It's only really the sentence level and syntactic, events in sentences that kind of trigger these fluctuations in delta theta phase amplitude coupling. Okay, and then I'm arguing that large language models will be helpful in isolating properties of these statistical features at the RNO levels, but not very helpful with isolating higher order features. Okay, that's a very quick overview of a more kind of detailed model, but I'll go into some details now. So the higher levels of rows provide instructions for symbolic phrase structure, and the lower levels provide probabilistic aspects of processing. And the cross-frequency coupling is where you get the interfacing between these two systems, right? Between the updating of symbolic information through statistical inference. So there's a lot of motivations that I talk about in the papers to defend the idea that delta theta interregional pack constructs multiple sets of syntactic and semantic features and imposes biases on how to read out the items provided by this phase code. This occurs when the phase of delta is synchronized with the amplitude of theta, and in turn, neighboring complexes theta phase couples with high frequency local cortical processing through theta gamma coupling. So delta represents superordinate syntactic categories. A lot of work by Andre Martin, Niding, and David Popel have kind of shown this strong relationship between these bands here. And theta represents feature bundles generated via lexical access. So phase resetting of this mechanism permits a facility for recursive self-call, essentially. Okay. So the bulk of work that's done under this Rose model is achieved via, a frontotemporal symbolic low-frequency phase code interacting with a series of local probabilistic inferences over these lexosemantic features, with the latter being implemented via spike phase coupling, assembling bundles of linguistic features, and which can emerge into dynamical motifs. So, as I've already said, single unit encoding of accepted features, high frequency gamma sensory-motor transformations into lexical objects, low frequency neural programs for generating structural inferences over these higher frequency ensembles, and then finally local and global workspaces through traveling waves for bottom-up lexical memory on top-down hierarchical memory. Okay. So the basic data structures of syntax are atomic features, types of linearly readable mental representations. And I assume, I'll just gloss over this quickly, but all the representations I assume are kind of standard in the linguistics literature. Noun, complementizer, prepositional, lexical features and things like that, which sounds a bit exotic potentially, right? Not neurally plausible, but then, we already entertain stubby animate concepts in higher order vision, right? Representational eccentricity is already normalized in sensory neuroscience, right? So it's not too far outside the field to boil down linguistics to these features. But even if you just assume noun and verb or object action, general semantic categories, that's also fine too. And so therefore, depending on the lexical item in question that you access, that will determine which part of the brain is involved in this neural program, this low frequency neural code. So spikes from relevant cortical regions will be coordinated based on what type of word feature you're accessing. So in this paper, Cortical Cascade Support Rapid Semantic Inference During Reading, under review at the moment, we show a single word paradigm, museum, loyalty. You see these words on screen, orthographic processing, and you decide whether it's concrete or abstract. We also have some mid-scale words that are kind of more difficult and hard to judge. And we show that MTG and PSTS seems to be more involved or more engaged for abstract words over concrete words. So that would kind of narrow down where exactly in the brain these particular abstract features would be. So it's not. I don't think it's a coincidence that this part of the brain, the posterior temporal part of the brain, is sensitive to language specific representations like abstract words, but also language specific structures, right? So language specific representations and language specific structures. So Rose also invokes effective coupling and dynamical motifs to guide the construction of minimally complex linguistic objects. And these would likely be commonly co-occurring lexicosemantic features that routinely get merged via the mechanisms of Rose, right? Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about these. L. Miller's talked about this on this channel a few times before. But these are just parts that are restricted to generating individual clusters of atomic features, not recursively constructed sets, right? That's the S&E level. This is just assembling, routinely and commonly co-occurring lexical features, as it is in other domains that have invoked dynamical motifs. So empirical data for stable local attractors or motifs in higher order language regions remain limited, of course. But still, the use of dynamical motifs for lexical information seems all the more plausible in the face of widespread, flexible, and mixed high-dimensional coding across the cortical hierarchy. So, in fact, if you guys want to read more about this, there's my paper was a target article in this volume of Cognitive Neuroscience, and there are a bunch of commentary articles about the paper. This is a very nice paper from Nina Kazanina, a friend of mine and her student, who are trying to flesh out the technical details here about, okay, dynamical motifs are potentially a plausible feature of lexical items in general, but let's talk about the details here. And they give some very nice ideas about how this could be concretized more forcefully. Some interesting evidence here as well from intracranial work in single units in humans from a French lab, Sander Haynes lab, and Itzhak Fried in California. And they have single unit recordings in, I think, 21 epilepsy patients. And altogether, they had 1,000 units in these 21 patients. And these are units located in language areas, right? Not sensory areas, but posterior temporal and IFG. And across these 1,000 units in these 21 patients, they found plenty of evidence that there were single units sensitive to semantic features and phonological features. But out of the 1,000 units, 0 units responded to any syntactic information, right? Not a single unit cared about anything to do with syntax, which I think is pretty good, pretty decent evidence for the type of Rose model that I'm presenting here. So again, not to go back to the sin of localizationism, but of course, computation takes place somewhere in the brain, right? It has to happen somewhere. And this is a general schema that's inspired very heavily by William's work on the cortical organization of syntax. Just if you guys are interested in the general kind of topology of where in the brain these sorts of processes are, I've already mentioned posterior temporal cortex being critical for compositional syntax, and then frontal cortex being more involved in sequencing workspaces and things like that. So prefrontal cortex may host circuits supporting variable binding, sequencing, gating, working memory, the kind of stuff that L. Miller's talked about, while lateral posterior temporal cortex might more reliably and efficiently subserve cross-modal semantic integration. In fact, there's a YouTube video that came out a few months ago from PBS where they talk about the fiercest debate in linguistics, and just coincidentally, they don't talk about any details, but they do happen to show universal grammar on the brain, and just purely by coincidence, it happens to be more or less where it should be, which is nice. Okay, so these traveling waves that I mentioned, what do they do? Well, they seem to build up the workspace cycle by cycle, right? I mentioned workspaces at maybe 15, 20 minutes ago. And that's kind of their role, right? Like building up this more elaborate, more complex workspace for language. There's evidence recently for the functional role of traveling waves in all sorts of different aspects of cognition that I'll just gloss over quickly, but there's a lot of evidence for it. And then I also talk about in the paper how this is done, right? So I've mentioned kind of statically, delta, theta does this, theta, gamma does that. But in the real-time dynamics of language processing, depending on the type of way you parse a sentence, right, you can either do it more predictively or less predictively. This happens in comprehension, right? When you're comprehending something, it's a little bit more bottom-up because you don't necessarily know what the person's going to say. Whereas in production, you have a decent schema of the plan you're going to say. So this top-down parser during neural dynamics of production seems to be more suitable and predictive of neural behavior. So again, just a quick point that these dynamics of how the human parser constructs linguistic inferences is also kind of nature of the prediction here, right? So very clear predictions for experimental research. And in the 2025 paper, I review how a lot of these predictions, well, some of them are kind of hinted at in some recent empirical research. I've already kind of prefaced this critique here. The spatiotemporal dynamics that I'm evoking here are not to be thought of as the principal and exclusive drivers, right, of parsing operations. They are the principal driver, right? They're not the exhaustive driver. So these are the dynamics with the largest explanatory causal scope for specific operations, and the ones that best predict it. And again, as I said, there's some evidence that I cite in the literature for this. But then, of course, well, doesn't this make falsifiability of rows difficult? No, it doesn't. And I'll explain why. So rows provides a possible scheme for flexibly implementing distinct types of parsing operations for the real-time processing of language. And as I've said, this helps furnish a more restrictive definition of the core language network, right? So the core language network is involved in these symbolic parsing operations, as opposed to the lower order kind of statistical inferences. So like I said, my friend Nina Kazanina, she's been talking to me about these issues for a while. May 2024, when talking about the first Rose paper, she argued that there's not enough clear experimental predictions. And then a couple months ago, she told me that there's now too many experimental predictions. So I'm not sure what to make of that, but you guys can be, the judge. If there's too many or too few, well, who knows? And yeah, speaking of being a critic, I have a paper with Oscar Woolnough where I kind of summarize some of these ideas about critiquing the definition of the language network in relation to some of the work done in the literature, which you may be interested in. So Rose indexes, again, to echo some themes discussed on this channel quite a lot, and what physicists would call a mesoscopic protectorate, right? A kind of a emergent level of organizational complexity where you no longer need to look under the hood at lower order details. And this leads to this particular model here, where I talk about the causal relations between these R, O, S, and E components. So I'll just go through this quickly. Just to summarize, it's dependent on the idea that phase amplitude coupling coordinates the hierarchical assembly of features, forming hedonist inferences, while dynamical motifs and spike phase coupling coordinate constellations of semantic features into lexical items. Okay, that's the first stage. And then between these levels, R, O, S, and E, there's explicit, building on some nice work in the literature in philosophy of science, on causal composition, integration, and exclusion can apply across these levels, yielding this mesoscopic protectorate in the brain that protects and shields syntactic inferences against interference. So Rose uses a combination of these things I mentioned earlier, right? It uses a combination of mechanisms, cascades, topological structures to neurally enforce non-associativity, commutativity, and other algebraic properties of human language, thus ensuring that old men and women is inferred as old men and women versus old men and women, for example, right? So a few more technical points and I'll finish. I realize I've gone way over time as always. But Rose enables potentially unbounded recursion until rising frontotemporal parietal alpha signals that the set is basically full, the workspace is full. And then it begins to interfere and the structure begins to break down. There's some other details that may be relevant to do with parsing and memory that I'll just gloss over quickly. And then, okay, the final point about universality, right? Differences too between children and adults. I'll skip over this quickly. This is L. Miller's work, right? Just to show there's a little bit of sympathy here, right? He has a content control model where gamma carries content, control is done by alpha beta. That's roughly similar to what I'm doing with Rose, right? Some of you may remember this, episode 2, where Sander already argued that oscillations can potentially provide a syntax, but maybe not semantics. Similar ideas echoing through here, I think, as well. And then finally, there's some nice work by computer scientists Bob Berwick and mathematician Matilda Marcoli at Caltech, and they wrote this paper fairly recently, and they focus on Rose as a plausible candidate theory for syntax. And what they do is, you remember earlier I mentioned all this technical language to do with the algebraic properties of language, right? Category theory, free, non-associative, commutative, magma, and so on and so on. So just to bring that back, they write this proof showing that the mechanisms of Rose that I invoke can be mathematically connected to the algebraic properties of merge as cashed out, as formulated in the category theoretic half algebraic formulation of merge, right? So moving beyond naive set theory. which I think provides hints towards a genuinely explanatory theory of neurolinguistics. Now, there's an open question here, which I think is interesting and I'm pursuing at the moment. How can we guarantee that the structures generated by rows comply with these algebraic features rather than simply generating node boundaries and bracket boundaries, just in case the structure turns out to be non-associative? Some discussion in this paper here. But so if mathematical linguistics can point more easily towards rows than towards other neural mechanisms, neural processes, then I think this leads us towards an exciting terrain of previously inaccessible neurolinguistic research, where, of course, the classical Marian goal, right? What is the Marian goal? It's to kind of connect and draw principled relations between the computational level, the algorithmic level, and the implementational level. So I think that's what we're trying to do here. So a scientific theory is only as successful as the number of new, interesting, and cool questions it helps open up, right? So ROSE has been used productively to frame and explain a range of neuroimaging and EEG results. Forthcoming work from other labs explores how it can help researchers ask new questions about bilingualism, SLA, dependency resolution, and things like that. There's a recent review article arguing that it's a fairly comprehensive description, compared to existing models in the literature. Some of these other commentaries you can read. I'll just quickly gloss over them. Nice one from Wan Uragareka. A nice argument from Trettenbreen, arguing that we should really think about sign language too, right? If we build, I critique the neuroscience of consciousness for building its model through vision. Well, Patrick makes the same point here, right? If we build our model of language in the brain purely through auditory and orthographic processing, we'll be missing out on a big part of the puzzle, which is, of course, sign language, because sign language is still a natural language. So that's a good way to validate and test it further. Some interesting evolutionary concerns by Edward Shih here about potential predecessors for the neural circuits that I invoke. Another article by my friend Giuseppe Baggio. He makes a more technical point about potentially rows may not exhaust the ways in which the human brain can compose meaning, right? You can maybe build meaningful structures without using the S and E levels. And that is absolutely true. And in fact, I kind of say that in the paper. There's nothing in my model that requires meaning be constructed always via this syntax-driven apparatus, which is why I also invoke delta, gamma, domain general combinatorics, and other types of things. So autonomous semantic composition is completely wholly compatible with rows to account for things like idiomatic, kind of single instance, single utterances kind of interpretations, where you don't necessarily need to rely on syntax. This goes into a separate issue in psycholinguistics, which is when you do sentence processing in the wild, do you always do higher order syntax? Do you always do this merge business? Well, no, probably not. Right, probably not. There's other sorts of more efficient ways you can do it too, like good enough parsing, right? So I do not demand that the human brain uses these structures every single time it does language. Okay, so I've also presupposed there's some kind of innate endowment here, right, for the neural organization of syntactic computations. Children use hierarchical knowledge and statistical learning jointly. Just some very quick points here that I'll just gloss over very quickly. Infants already compute hierarchical rather than linear relations. There's a lot of good evidence for innatism for language, despite what its critics routinely say, of course. We've been having this debate since the 1960s. But I think there is very strong evidence for some innate inductive bias rule, whatever you want to call it, some kind of structure-based, merge-based rule as being the minimal scheme that children seem to bring with them to the table when they do language. Some of the points here, again, I've already said there's no half-merge solutions, classic property of the stimulus issues, neurolinguistic evidence for rapid syntactic inferences in adults and children. Skip over this. So yeah, just to summarize, this whole mechanistic business that I've been mentioning is completely fine, and Rose invokes neural mechanisms too. But there's also other more abstract and maybe more mysterious neural processes and structures that could potentially be invoked here. And I think this is actually, maybe linguists have some blame here, right? Where linguists and neurolinguists are typically more tied to this kind of more intuitive kind of localizationist model of language, which of course people like Louis have critiqued very well. And I think what I'm trying to do here is maybe pushing towards that direction. Again, just pushing back on some of the ideas that I'm talking about in Rose, right? It's, as people like El have talked about, cells contribute to function, but they don't causally anchor it. There's types of information encoded and can be extractable and recoverable from the LFP that are not represented at single units, et cetera, et cetera. Again, skip over this. There's also some other physical bounds for cognition that may be of relevance for neurolinguistics. So things like algorithmic complexity that I've talked about in a paper with Carl Friston and Emma Holmes. other sorts of constraints that we can maybe think about in relation to how the brain executes these processes. But again, this is just a general background assumption. This paper migrates concepts from linguistics over to statistical physics, as I mentioned. Okay, I'll just skip over this. Okay, so just to finish, it may seem intuitive that both brains and LLMs do very similar things, as people argue, but our intuitions about the three main branches of philosophy also turn out to be wrong, right? Our human intuitions often turn out to not be very good. So the idea that no statement can be true and false at the same time, that turned out to be wrong. Reducing pain and increasing happiness is, the guiding principle of living a good life. No, that's too simplistic. Everything must have a sufficient cause or reason. That also turns out to be wrong. So I think a lot of our intuitions about language are also probably going to be wrong, right? All of cognitive neuroscientists, when they do, linguistic research, they bring with them their intuitions about what human language is and what it's used for and how it evolved and so on. And those are human intuitions, right? Just like any other domain of science, we have to challenge our intuitions. Okay, so when someone says, but real understanding of the brain requires lower level causal details, again, we say, well, says who, right? When people argue our artificial neural network, our neural language model offers a biologically plausible account of language, well, if that's true, what are the concrete neurobiological predictions, right? It's often claimed in the connectedness literature, our model offers a neurobiologically plausible account of semantics. Well, okay, so what are the predictions for different scales of neural complexity and recording from single units to LFP to ECOG and fMRI? What are the predictions for what you're going to see in the brain if this is so neurobiologically plausible, right? And that's kind of a critique that I'm bringing with me, an anxiety that I have as well when I write these papers. And also, LLMs don't really seem to fit in super clearly with standard categories for types of scientific explanations, right? There's causal and non-causal, but LLMs are not really clearly fit into any of these. Right? Maybe they can contribute, and they do contribute to some topological types of structures and analyses, but it's kind of hard to see them as replacing linguistics, as some people argue. So in conclusion, diverse causal landscapes in the brain can derive distinct components of language. And explanatory neuroscience will require the causal language of linguistics to be neuroscience language to be in sympathy. And this can't happen if we frame language as centered on probabilistic statistics, because that's not what it is. That's not what human language is, right? And there is something unique about our species' evolutionary ecological niche. We inhabit more than any other species a richly symbolic, logical, and causal mental realm. That's what we are. So we should not be surprised if sidelining these concepts in favor of statistical, functional, and frequentist tools offers little help in theory formation for language. So yeah, I'll just thank my lab and my collaborators, and then I will stop talking. And I apologize for going way over time as well.
All right. Thanks so much. That was a lot, a lot to digest and a lot of to think about. So I just wanted to mention that today of all days, I do have a sharp deadline because I need to go to defense. So like around 52 after the hour, I'm gonna have to go. I don't know if people know if I leave, I don't know if there's a way to keep the recording going, but let's just have some commentary instead of wasting time with this. Let's have some brief commentary by William and Sander. I don't know which order you think it's best to go, but maybe you have some thoughts that you want to share, and then we can kind of open for the discussion, for the general discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind going first if that's okay with Sander. So it's very interesting and provocative, and I have some things I could say about the LLMs and the concept of language statistics, but I'm going to leave that aside for now because I think there's plenty of other contexts in which that is being discussed. I think my reaction when perceiving this stuff is one of the papers that you did not cite in yours is the David Popel and David Embich's seminal commentary on the defining the relation between linguistics and neuroscience, or linguistics and neurobiology. And so at the time, I think when they wrote this paper, they were critiquing, a lot of work in neurolinguistics as being very vague and general in terms of their specificity of the concepts from linguistics. And they're saying, well, syntax is in Broca's area. Well, what do you mean by syntax? That's not really a claim about anything in terms of underlying computations or primitives that we understand from linguistics. And they talk about the chasms between the vocabulary and the concepts of neuroscience and linguistics, right? And how that's a difficult problem to solve, and that current approaches are really not doing it well, in a sense. I'm really grossly oversimplifying. But in my view, there's sort of there's two different paths perhaps that one can take following that sort of critique, which is to try to draw all of the lines as specifically and comprehensively as possible, which I think is in some sense what you've attempted to do, is to specify out in great detail sort of each different chain in the link between linguistics and neuroscience. But it seems to me that there's a sort of Goldilocks ideal place to be, which is that you want your theory or approach to be usable and to not necessarily be portrayed in such detail that everything becomes tendentious because of the decisions that you've made in specifying those details. So, I mean, and a good example of this is John Hale's work. They're testing different parsing algorithms, and they say, well, given a particular linguistic representation, how is the sentence parsed, right? And you can think of many different kinds of parsing algorithms, right? And they've been trying to test all of these different parsing algorithms, but even their work, in a sense, is limited because there are many different linguistic theories, many different possible underlying structures, and then there are many different parsing algorithms, and then there are many different neural implementations. And so, my concern with this work, I'm curious what your thoughts about this is, how usable is it to make such a finely detailed approach? My conclusion from David Popel and David Embich's critique has been to try to increase a little bit the granularity of what we're doing at the linguistics at a level that then I feel comfortable connecting with the tools that I'm using, which are fMRI and lesion symptom mapping and aphasia, right? So, instead of saying syntax in the brain, I'm like, well, there's a distinction between hierarchical and linear processing, and that plays out. And I can try to associate that with the data that I've collected and the deficits that we're seeing in patients. So, I guess my response or my question for you is, how useful is this currently specified theory really in spelling out predictions that we can be confident in terms of the data that we're using? That's my main response.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, that's
yeah.
that's a really good
Yeah,
question.
go ahead, Elliot. Yeah. I think
I'll
that's
be
a
very
really,
quick.
yeah, no, I really think that it's a really target, the main point I think that is worth discussing here is very much that, because I just very briefly, sorry to
Yeah.
intervene here, but it's interesting because not being at the level of knowing much at all, near zero about language, it's interesting how the details and the multiple levels of explanatory targets that you develop seem so broad as to, from an outsider's perspective, to seem like how much traction work can you really get out of this type of approach. So I think that it is really basically what William said much better than I'm saying, but I think it's really a critical point that I think that you can consider in further developing your work, for sure.
Yeah. No, totally. The first thing to say is that the predictions that I make about, where you're going to find reliable neural signatures of lexical processing versus structural processing versus compositional semantic processing, as I review, kind of have been satisfied to a large extent by the recent human single neuron work, classic MEG work, intracranial work. So I think it's not a coincidence that when we find reliable signatures of syntax, they happen to be in the domains that I'm kind of poking at. So I think, so the reason why I didn't cite that Embik paper in this paper is because I've cited it too much elsewhere, right? Like in 2015, my 2020 book, and my 2024 book too, I kind of build my whole theory using Popel's critique. In fact, the reason why I got into this field was because when I read in 2012, I read Popel's Maps and Mapping Problem. So I've cited that exhaustively. So I'm kind of building off that work in what I'm doing here. But so Popel's main critique, right, and Embik's main critique is basically that nouns are not the same things as neurons, right? Nouns are just very distinct beasts from cells. And yeah, that's true. Totally true. Nouns are not the same things as neurons. But so what do we do, moving forward? I think the way that I've cashed it out in the connection between how we can formalize merge using the tools of like, category theory and all the things that I mentioned, we can use that to target and point towards specific neural dynamics and away from others, which is what the Marcoli and Berwick paper does, right? I think this is a good example of how to leverage this in a productive kind of empirical way. And if it can be the case that whenever you do a merge computation, you would predict fluctuations in the types of, neural and processes and mechanisms that I mentioned arose, which is what Marcoli links merge with phase synchronization, right? And different types of phase amplitude coupling. If whenever you predict a merge computation or a node closure or some type of syntactic load, that is a prediction, right? That's a prediction for when you see these low frequency effects. And that's exactly what I kind of document in the paper. So even Popel himself, right, who's of course hyper skeptical about unifying and linking and reducing and all these sorts of things, even he does the same thing, right? So he has his low frequency delta papers, right, where he shows delta entrainment over the course of sentence processing is correlated with specific moments of syntactic inference. And that's all I'm doing too, right? Like I'm just doing what David does and just assuming that delta's doing some syntax business, but I'm just linking it more explicitly into phase amplitude coupling and some other lower order spike stuff. So I don't think, and I've spoken to David about this as well. So I don't think that what I'm doing is not in the spirit of David and Embik's kind of critique of the incommensurability between linguistics and neuroscience. I think it's in the spirit. I think what I'm doing is kind of being quite cautious and conservative about if there is such a thing as, and by the way, I'm not trying to explain all of language at this point, right? I'm just trying to explain how you build a single phrase unit, right? You access a lexical item and then you build a phrase. How do you make that categorize it? That's all that rows is. It's just saying this is what you do when you assemble two things and you put them together and you categorize it and then you repeat it. So I'm not trying to reach into domains of like pragmatics or the use of language and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I would say just to summarize, the kind of predictions that I'm offered are of a sufficiently appropriate resolution for different recording scales that are accessible through different labs, right? Units versus LFP versus MEG and low frequency dynamics and all the rest of it. And a lot of the dynamics, or a lot of the things that I've predicted are kind of in a space that is accessible and very testable and indeed falsifiable. So I would just say the core components of rows can very easily be falsified, right, and disproven. So it's not as if I'm kind of couching myself into a domain where there's too many predictions that if at least one of them is satisfied, then it's all fine. No, there are certain things which are surprising to me, like the lack of single unit effects for any feature in syntax, for example. That's pleasantly surprised. I wasn't expecting that, but it kind of pleasantly surprised me.
Maybe I can just end by saying one thing. Like I think if the paper was titled "Syntactic Structure Building is Instantiated by Phase Amplitude Coupling Generated in Posterior Temporal Cortex and Frontal with Certain Frequency Bands," then I feel, okay, that's a very specific and more narrow claim that I could dig my teeth into. But I think when I see the paper and I see the presentation of it, it feels much broader and abstract than that. And it makes it more difficult for me to engage with than a more specific claim. So I'll just simply say something like a claim about phase amplitude coupling instantiating a neural operation, a syntactic operation, then I feel that's something I can work with. But the way that the framework is conveyed, I'll just say it just feels overwhelming and broader or more abstract than I can. So I'll just end with that.
No, so that's a fair point, a totally fair point. In fact, that's why in 2015, when I first proposed this kind of phase synchronization to syntax thing, I did just call it that. And then in 2020, in my book, I didn't even call it a model, right? I didn't have a name for the model. I just called it, this is how the brain does syntax. And then only in 2024 was I confident enough that I could maybe assemble this into a model. And then in 2025, it was a discussion article. So I was encouraged to kind of, in these target articles, you kind of have to sell like a big, tendentious claim, right? So my tendentious claim was that, well, this is a universal neural grammar, not just that this is where PSTS, encodes syntax in low frequencies. It was a more kind of general statement about the function of the model. So maybe next year I'm going to write a paper called Rows, a Theory of Everything, a unifying theory of the universe. Maybe we'll see. But yeah, that's kind of the pragmatic motivation for why I wrote that.
For that article, you're going to have to co-author it with Tristan, though. But since you already write with him, I think it's a very natural extension of it. No, just kidding. So, Sander, why don't you give your some comments? And what I'm going to do is the following. Since everyone, so every one of you, the three of you, has co-host status. So I'm going to just mute myself and take the video out, and you can continue for as long as you want. But one person should finalize it at the end in the meeting, because that terminates the recording. Because otherwise, this could go for hours and I don't know, cause some trouble with the eventual saving of this file. So yeah, go ahead, but I'll disappear in just 3 minutes. But yeah, thank you so much everyone for the discussion, and hopefully some of the audience some of the participants can also engage with the discussion.
Thanks, Louis. Thank you very much. Yeah. But so you want us just to, once we finish, just like click leave the meeting? Like
no. So once you're done,
yeah.
Like for instance, I'll go in 3 minutes, and in 10 minutes or 20 minutes you finish. Let's say you, Elliot, why don't you, when everything is done, you actually close the meeting, you terminate it.
Okay, gotcha.
Because you're as a co-host, you can terminate it as well.
Okay, sweet.
Okay.
There's also a stop recording button that's available to us, so we should probably press that before leaving as a co-host.
If that's available, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, you can do that too. But once the meeting ends by a host, it actually stops the recording. But yeah,
exactly.
Probably a better way. Yeah.
Okay, so first, thanks for inviting me, and it's great to meet you, Elliot. We've never actually met, so that's really cool. So yeah, I guess I have a lot of thoughts also about the first part of your presentation, but I'll just like William, I'll just focus in on the actual Rose model. And so more broadly, I think so what I like about the paper is that it sort of it modernizes this problem of finding linking hypotheses, because we used to look for brain areas or circuits, or we have Broca's area, and it's supposed to implement some sort of computation, right? And it took actually quite a long time. I mean, neuroscience started very early already looking at brain waves, but it's really taken quite a long time for this modernization to come, in which we also look at brain dynamics. And this is of course one linking hypothesis to take very seriously. And there's a good point to be made that we haven't done that so far. And so I take the Rose model to be one attempt at carving out the psycholinguistic computations into one sort of organizational scheme. You have representations, you build them into structures, you do operations over them. That seems fair to me. And then you invoke brain dynamics much more centrally as the actual mechanism or whatever. So I think that's good. I think, but I do think that a lot of the old problems remain, and you've touched on this quite a lot. But to my mind, it's like we only really have a mechanistic explanation if we can engineer a system using a computational model in which you sort of infuse the implementational details in some way. And what you get as a virtue of that, you get these algorithms that'll actually get you the syntax. And I think that's the real challenge that we are dealing with. And the nice thing about these dynamical phenomenon like phase amplitude coupling, for example, or phase resets, is that if one thinks about them, or traveling waves, if one thinks about them, one can already start to see a bit of a glimpse about the additional mechanistic force that it gets you over and above just seeing a brain area light up, right? Because you need, in language, you do need to ship representations from A to B, and you do need to implement algorithms. And algorithms are intrinsically temporal. If you think about it, they involve representations and sequential transformations over them. So in this sense, I guess I will take Rose more as a sketch, or as a as a taking stock effort. But I do think that if we really want to turn this into a tractable and testable explanation, I think we have to, basically the way I would put it is we have to spend a little bit less time in the lab and a little bit more time in the computer room. We have to take all these findings and we actually have to make them work. And I think that this is the real challenge and the next sort of frontier of language neuroscience, is to take all these links that we built and that you also built in your intracranial work, and to actually make a concrete prediction or a concrete implementation even of syntax. That's sort of my main take. So I think from my perspective, though, the spatial aspect is still absolutely critical, because let's say you have a representation for a lexical item or a word or a concept. It's nice and well to say that you need sort of a burst of gamma activity to activate that and to sort of bring it into an activation space. But that seems to me like a relatively small part of the computational problem. The real challenge to me is, how do you store information? And once you activate it, once you use the brain dynamic to have it active, of course you have to combine it with other representations. But how does the brain, the brain might use phase synchronization or whatever to bind the two representations, but how does it know exactly to connect the two? Because it's just a lot of chatter in the brain. How do you make that work without appealing to, the good old homunculus, right? And the only way to do that is to build computational models in which you make the bare bones assumptions of some implementation, and then you try to get the thing that you want, which is syntax.
Yeah, no, totally. That's a lot of really good points there, Sander. Very good points. I think a lot of it kind of echoes. So, the paper that you wrote critiquing Casanina and Popel's, hippocampal compositional model, a lot of the critiques that you levied towards them, very well, by the way, I think are the kind of anxieties that kind of I wrestle with as well, actually, about what is the expressive scope of PAC, right? So there's been a debate in the last maybe 5 or 6 years about, phase amplitude coupling is a great thing. Does it get you multiplexing? Is it only capable of sequential, order, item ordering, right? So a lot of people like Giessen and also Popel have looked at theta gamma coupling during, sequencing, like so random objects, pictures of random objects, and you use theta gamma coupling to kind of reorder and hold them in memory. But I think one of the things that is really exciting, and why I really agree with what you're saying about we need to spend time in the lab, but we also need to spend time at the blackboard too, right? At the whiteboard, thinking about these issues, is because we still haven't thought very clearly about what the full computational scope of for example, phase amplitude coupling might be. So we know it's good enough just for, ordering morphemes, right? Going back to the 2012 paper by Popel and I'm blanking on her name, sorry. Someone can help me here. The 2012 paper with oscillations and syllables. Giraud, thank you, Christoph. Yeah, Giraud and Popel paper, right, where they kind of associate phase amplitude couple, or they associate rhythms, I should say, like specific frequency bands with specific sizes of morphophonological complexity. But I think we can't take this for granted. I think there's a sense in which we don't actually know how much of syntax phase amplitude coupling can actually get you, right? That's an open question, because once you get into the more precise technical mathematical details about these things, and the final section of my Rose paper talks about some of these issues in a bit more detail, but I think that is an open question. So even in debates between Tavano and Casanina in their Nature review paper in 2023 and the commentaries that came from that, there's a bit of tension in there as well. If you read the response from Andre Martin or you read the response from Lars Meyer, there's a little bit of tension between, okay, we kind of know that PAC gets you something. We kind of know that PAC can get you morphophonological sequencing, but to what extent can it get you hierarchy? To what extent can it get you recursive hierarchy, right? To what extent can it get you chunking versus syntax, right? That's a very subtle distinction that people like Ding have talked about. And for me, that is still an open question, completely open. But I think we need to be a bit more forgiving and a bit more imaginative about what these processes can do. But I also agree with what you're saying about one of these, it's fashionable to say, localization is not explanation. And of course, yeah, obviously it isn't. Of course not. But localization, as William has shown, right, in his work, is also super important, and it can kind of constrain and narrow. If you know where in the brain certain pieces of syntactic information seem to be causally, encoded or driven, that can also help you narrow down these sorts of issues because of things like, what are the endogenous typical like firing rates like in this region? What's the dominant frequency band? The kind of endogenous kind of resting state behavior of the hippocampus versus PSTS has very different properties and cell types. So based on where these things happen in the brain, will narrow down immediately and help you constrain your search space for the neural dynamics question. The neural dynamics follow from the localizationism, right? It's not as if you can have these sorts of, I'm not making the claim that this Rose model is just floating around in some kind of Platonic space and then it just happens to be instantiated in posterior superior temporal cortex. It's not a coincidence that it happens there, right? The localizationism is constrained in ways that I think even, people like Friederici have talked about for a while, to do with the fact that these circuits, aspects of the posterior arcuate fasciculus seem to be driving certain recursive properties of language potentially. But then, as you said, the question is like, how is it done? And that's what I see myself as doing. I see myself as just building on the kind of localizationist work of, of William and Angela and all these other people, and just saying, how can it potentially happen? But for me, so yeah, that's why I'm a bit more comfortable talking about PAC in relation to things like commutativity and non-associativity. But one of the questions that I'm wrestling with at the moment is that PAC can also get you structures that comply with that are associative, right? So I think it's difficult and maybe just an empirical question more than a theoretical question ultimately, actually, when and how these pack dynamics are cashed out, whether the structure is going to be inferred as associative or non-associative. And I think that will require some very careful, tricky experimental materials to figure out, pack dynamics versus old men and women versus old men and women 1 and 2, those sorts of things. But the only final thing I would say here is this is why I'm a little bit keen to push back on some of the naturalistic trends in the literature, where people seem to think that, just exposing people to a podcast and annotating features of, syntactic complexity and semantic load and so on will be sufficient to help you deliver a lot of these complex features of language and separate them from other types of interfering components of language, like the close relationship between lexicality, syntax, and semantics, and so on. So I think, much more, much more imagination is needed in these domains, and not to be too quick to dismiss potential mechanisms as, oh, it can only get you this, right? PAC can only get you this, spiking syntax, can only get you this. And even to be fair, just to critique the other dimension, we also have to be honest about the connectionist side too here, right? It's, people, linguists have dismissed the connectionist literature for a long time as, oh, it can only get you certain properties of statistical learning and language learning. Well, that also maybe is not true either. So yeah, that's all I'd say. Well, so yeah, maybe William or Sander, do you guys want to come back with that? And anybody else, I guess, who wants to, open up and discuss is free to as well.
I actually have a question, but it's kind of unrelated to what you guys were talking about. I study social linguistics actually in relation to neuroscience, and I really like the papers you published about oscillations, but it always come to my mind that you only focus on the parts of the language building that are categorical in the sense that it's described in social linguistic work. My question is about is there any paper or any prediction about how language varies and how we actually handle with the variation in language, the social motivated variation actually, what, for example, Labov studied for 50 years or so?
Yeah, great question. I'm working with somebody at the moment about using this Rose model to think about issues in bilingualism, L1 versus L2 stuff. With respect to the sociological stuff, I think As I said at the beginning, a lot of the variations in language are at the morpho-phonological space, so that would yield predictions about which element, ROSE, is going to be modulated and modified during those sorts of dynamics. So as I said, I would expect within the space of complex social linguistic, research, that the concept of, John, or the concept of elephant will be triggering, the same types of clusters and ensembles as it would be during, writing, an exam versus having a conversation about these things. The real question actually is the interface between the language network and other systems, right? Multiple demand, default mode, and so on. We have some forthcoming work about this, actually, that the interface of the language network to these other parts of the brain that deal with multiple demand questions. And it seems to be happening in the low frequency space, in the alpha frequency domain. But so that would, and again, this is where Rose can generate predictions about when language interfaces and updates instructions to other systems. It does so using these particular frequency bands, right? There are specific bands that you can chase after, and you can test that theory. So I think the social linguistic questions that you're interested in would need to be addressed through figuring out which extra linguistic modules or extra linguistic brain networks would you expect to be triggered by these sorts of social linguistic, which I don't know enough about. I'm not a sociolinguist, but I think you'd have to narrow down, like, okay, there's a language network, that's great, but then which of these extra linguistic core language, cognitive faculties or brain networks would be likely triggered or involved in sociolinguistic processes, right? And I just don't know enough about that topic to say more than that, to be honest. Yeah, you have your hand up, Leonardo. Yeah.
Thank you. By the way, Pedro and I are from the same lab. We also have another colleague here, Johnny. It's a pleasure to meet you. I do need to mention that your papers have been discussed at length and are a recurrent theme in our labs meetings, in our lab meetings. One thing that I wanted to ask is that, as you put in the beginning of your presentation, the large language models, they were not thought of, and they are not theories of language. And then you presented this more generative, formalist view of language as, I'm lacking some words here, but as a more productive way to investigate language and syntax. However, as was mentioned, as has already been mentioned, there are other linguist theories against which you can put your views. So, for example, construction grammar, which offers a, let's say, more as it is put, a more lexicalized view of grammar. And even though it speaks more of how language is represented, it does have implications for how we would process language. So, for example, how does your model, your view of language processing and representation compare to construction grammar? This is one question. And another question that is related to this one is if you are able to see a way in which we can conciliate the possibility that we process syntax in this generative manner with the architecture that you are proposing, but also considering maybe the possibility that through language use and experience, given that we do have a lexical semantic memory, it's possible that we also create templates, constructions, and that they are employed with in language use, if it's possible to conciliate both.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Thank you, Leonardo. And nice to meet you as well. Well, yeah, I guess I would just start by saying construction grammar for me kind of confuses the object with the process, right? Like the construction is the object of study for the construction grammarians. But of course, what I kind of care about is what's the underlying process that generates the construction in the first place. In order to have a construction, you have to make it, right? Yes, you do memorize things and you have templates for idioms and you have templates for common phrases and templates for small talk and all the sorts of, everyday utterances that social linguists and discourse analysts and construction grammar people think about. But I think that does confuse the process with the object. It's like if vision scientists or, people who studied, audition and speech were to only focus on a specific generated object or shape or a combination of colors or a particular sound type, a commonly co-occurring sound type with auditory neuroscience, right? You wouldn't do that. You boil down to the underlying representations and the underlying basic primitive operations that generate those things. So I think it just confuses the object with the process. But regardless, even if that's wrong or that's right, that's my opinion. But the more empirical question is, I think everything that I'm saying is completely compatible with the idea that human beings occasionally memorize idioms and memorize phrases and have templates. That's not a threat to the idea that syntax is implemented in this way. So, for example, I emailed Ray Jackendoff about this a while ago, and Ray Jackendoff is very much against the kind of Chomskyan generative enterprise. And he has his own theory. And he said, well, is this compatible with my theory? And, and we kind of had a bit of a back and forth. But ultimately, my position was like, well, if you assume that syntax is represented in the brain somehow, right? If you assume that if you at least assume that the brain implements syntax and derives, rapid real-time syntactic inferences that are independent of the statistics of your perceptual, epithelial capacities or whatever. If you at least assume that, then you have to have a story for how syntax is represented in the brain, right? Yes, and the answer is yeah, you do. So if you assume that, you can embed and incorporate rows into alternative architectures potentially. I haven't really thought about that too much. But at least if you assume that when you build a phrase, this is what I'm saying, the algebraic structures are realized through. So I think there's a good piece here that I can recommend you. Alessandro Tavano and Nina Casanina replied to a commentary by Lars Meyer's lab in 2023 or 2024, I think it was, maybe 2024, in the Nature Reviews Neuroscience Journal. And they pointed out a similar critique to what I'm giving you, but they made a nice point. They said, look, all these supposedly non-hierarchical theories of language, like construction grammar, right, usage-based theories, they claim to be non-hierarchical, right? They claim to be not concerning themselves with syntactic operations like a merge type process. But if you look at the details, they actually do smuggle in and presuppose a rich amount of hierarchy, even dependency grammar to some extent, right? So I think it's not considered enough the extent to which these non-hierarchical theories of language actually do invoke and presuppose a certain degree of hierarchy. Maybe not as rich or an automatic or as obligatory a type of hierarchy as a generative enterprise person would say, but at least I would assume that there is some differences there. Now, just to finalize, just to get to your question more concretely though, so I assume that syntactic inferences are not derived via probabilistic processes at the RNO level, right? Now, if you're the kind of linguist who assumes that there are, like Adele Goldberg, if you're the kind of person who assumes that syntax is exhausted by those processes, right, by those lower order probabilistic types of domain general processes, well, then you'll only generate predictions at the RNO level, right? You won't need to worry or concern yourself with the sorts of non-associative, bracket forming, bracket generating processes that I mentioned, right? You will advocate for statistics, and you'll also advocate for chunking, right? So a lot of these people advocate for chunking. They believe that there is chunking, but just not hierarchical recursive chunking necessarily, right? And there's a bit of a delicate topic in the literature, because a lot of people who do actually say, well, there probably is a bit of hierarchy in syntax, are a bit quiet about what they think the formal properties of that system are. And I think if you're not, we talk about open science these days, right? Open data, open everything. But I think what's important also is open theory, right? We need more open theory. We need more scientists to be open about what their theoretical, meta-theoretical, calculuses are, what they bring to the table when they make claims, empirical claims or conceptual claims about language. So I think you can't really make claims about the nature of language as being hierarchical or non-hierarchical, or laced with idioms, or sparsely saturated with idioms or whatever. You can't make those claims without also cashing out what you mean by what is the formal structure of language, right? And the reason why I say that is because you just need to cash it out. You can't just use rhetorical formulations, right? No other domain of cognitive science would allow you to make statements about attention or working memory or whatever without formally explaining what you mean by what is this computation, right? Searching, constructing, memories and things like that. You need to have some kind of formal structure to cash these things out. But also, more importantly, I think it's really exciting that in the last year or so, we've recently been able to show that if you take a very specific neural code for language that at least advocates for some mechanistic bases, like stuff that's not even controversial, like phase synchronization, that's not a controversial mechanism, right? I'm not doing what the consciousness guy is doing, and I'm not invoking quantum theory to explain syntax, right? I'm invoking pretty boring neural mechanisms, right? Like phase synchronization and pack. But I'm building into it a level of algebraic compatibility with the known mathematical structures of language. And I think when you do that, as I said before, if you look at the Marcoli and Berwick paper on arXiv, they show that if you do cache out language in this more specified, structured, and precise mathematical language, then that actually helps you. Right, just to address William's concern as well, right? That actually helps you narrow down on what type of predictions you would expect to see in human EEG when people do language. And that gives you it narrows down the hypothesis space instead of just saying, well, I expect phase synchronization everywhere. So for example, just to compare my model to someone else's. So Andrea Martin's model in a 2020 paper in Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience, her predictions were that you will see low frequency signatures of structure building. That's the main kind of empirical prediction. There will be some low frequency signatures of structure building. Now, I think that is a prediction that's been satisfied. Like, we do see that. But I don't think it's specific enough or precise enough. It's hard to falsify that, right? What kind of low frequency? Delta, theta? Do you mean increases or decreases, right? Does it obviate or necessitate only these dynamics? Does it also entertain other dynamics that can be occurring in parallel and might actually be more explanatorily powerful and useful, right? Is your model falsified if we also see single unit effects? If we don't see single unit effects? These are pretty important questions. And I think all I'm trying to do is, maybe it sounds ambitious and quite grandiose, but I don't think it is. All I'm saying is okay, if you have single unit recordings in PSTS, what do you expect to see? And then if you have LFP recordings next to your NeuroPixels probe, what do you expect to see? That's it. That's all I'm asking. It's so I think I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but yeah. That's kind of what I would say to that, right? Nothing that I'm saying here is incompatible with the idea that we have idioms and things like that. It's just about the kind of when and where you would expect these things to answer. Now, the more psycholinguistically controversial topic here is just a more traditional question, which is, when do human beings trigger their syntactic capacity? And that's a psycholinguistic question, right? So a lot of people have published on this, when you do language comprehension and production, when do you trigger and need to do this higher order syntax business? And when do you maybe not need to do it? Maybe you can just be a bit more relaxed and just rely on memory or rely on surface level good enough kind of processes, right? That's completely fine. And in fact, one tricky thing is that a lot of research has shown that there's a lot of idiosyncrasies between people, right? People differ in how eager they are to do syntactic prediction, right? Or syntactic kind of processes, right? Some people are more kind of relaxed and laissez-faire and just rely on lexicosemantic statistics. Other people are super eager and are more kind of engaged in the way that they parse sentences. It does differ between people. People differ here, right? A lot of eye tracking and self-paced reading stuff has shown that. So that's but the point that I'm trying to make is just whatever kind of human you are, right? If you're a James Joyce scholar, or if you're not a James Joyce scholar, will your brain at least have the potential to do this merge-based syntax? That's all I'm saying. So the kind of necessary component that I am saying is that, yes, every human being will at least have the capacity to implement this low-frequency neural program for syntax. And then if some people are, more driven by the statistics or more reliant on, cliches or idiomatic expressions in everyday conversation, then that's fine. But the final point I would say, though, is that just to go back to something that Sander mentioned, I think we also maybe underestimate the extent to which a lot of these processes are reflexively entertained and invoked in like everyday conversation, and also by other cognitive systems. Like other cognitive systems probably rely on these processes quite a lot. So one of the empirical predictions that I would have, and I'm kind of putting my cards on the table here, is that if it's true what I'm saying, that language is more of a thought system, or it's more triggered and used in different types of higher order cognition, then other people might say, well, then it may be the case, right, that the mechanisms of rows that I mentioned are called upon more readily in these non-linguistic spaces, right? Not specifically for the algebraic properties of language that I talked about, which is domain specific and specific to syntax. But if we do use our language system for other things, then that would be one kind of prediction of that, right?
Elliot, I have to take off, unfortunately. I hate to interrupt the discussion, but thank you for the opportunity to listen and hear the presentation, which was interesting. And I think also clarified a lot that maybe was not immediately clear to me from the paper, but I think the presentation did help to distill a lot of some of these concepts. But thank you. And I look forward to talking again in the future when I get the chance.
Awesome.
Okay, I'm
Cheers,
just gonna
William.
leave here. I think that will not disrupt anything, I hope. Okay.
All right. Thanks, William. Much appreciated. Much appreciated. Good to see you again.
Can I make a final comment, or have I run out of time?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so the paper you mentioned, or commentary from Nature Reviews, we've actually already discussed it in our one of our lab meetings, and the point is, right after I read it, I went to a professor at my university who researches construction grammar, and what he told me was that, for example, in terms of hierarchy, he offered me an alternative view. Not that constructions don't have hierarchy, but that they are, let's say, frozen. You have a pre-built hierarchy in your mental representation of your language, and they and you talked about they mistaken the object for the process, but I think they are aware, at least some of the papers that I've read, they are aware that you can treat it as an object, but they do treat it explicitly as a process. And for example, they draw evidence from structural priming to argue that grammar is actually based on lexicalized constructions, and that's one of the things that you've mentioned is actually something that puzzles me a lot, because I agree with your view that we do have these, let's say, basic components that generates language, but I do also believe that we can resort to other strategies, other processes to process language. But what's the breaking point? What's the boundary? What makes you go from one point to the other? This is something that really puzzles me. So anyway, it was just a final commentary, and thank you so much for your reply.
Yeah, no, thank you, Leonardo.
We'll have a lot to discuss in our lab, in our next lab meeting, by the way.
No, thank you. I'm flattered for the question. It's a very, very thoughtful question. I appreciate the comments very much. I would just say, I don't know. Here's my answer to the question. I don't know. But I will say, based on what I've read and the research that I did in my PhD at UCL, people do differ, like I said, in how eager they are for these more complex syntactic phenomena. The issue with the construction grammar thing is, yeah, I agree. They do have processes. They do have computations, chunking and things like that. My critique is more that there's also underlying computations that can potentially explain those supposed chunking procedures. So, for example, these frameworks are probably useful for, can you pass the salt? I'm going to the shops. I'll see you later. what do you want to watch on TV? These sorts of common statements. But every human being obviously has the capacity to internally manipulate those phrases, right? So I'm going to watch TV now, or, I'll see you later, right? If I say, I'll see you later, I can also say, any internal elaboration of that, right? So I'll see you guys later, right? I'll see you dudes later, whatever. You can internally compose and expand on that structure on the fly rapidly. And you can do that without any particular effort. And I think that's the kind of core problem that the construction grammar people have, right? They superficially entertain the wild complexity of human language. But I think it's not the wild complexity of human language that is really the problem. It's the subtle, tiny differences in the way that you generate sentences on the fly in unpredictable and creative ways. That's the problem for construction grammar. It's the fact that, yes, they're right. You do have templates that you memorize after you've been exposed to them, but you're also able to generate freely at will any new combination of sentences. As you can say any, you can, to take a sentence from Fry and Laurie, right? The sketch that I cited, Fry and Laurie, 1991. They say, here's a new sentence that's never been said before. You can say, hold the newsreader's nose squarely, waiter, or friendly milk will countermand my trousers, right? That's a completely fine sentence that everyone can hear and understand. And within it, there are maybe some memorized templates or chunks. But then you do a whole new thing, which is compositional processing, right? You infer on top of that a new compositional meaning that's never been generated before. And that's the process that I'm interested in. So Giuseppe Basio kind of has a critique of my paper that I mentioned briefly. That's kind of coming from the opposite perspective, right? So the usage grammar people will say, well, what about all these pre-existing templates? Giuseppe Basio actually says, well, what about these pre-existing super lower order semantic compositional processes, right? That are not even sophisticated syntactic hierarchical processes. So, and I'm kind of in the middle, right? I'm talking about regular phrase structure. Basio is talking about generic lexicosemantic composition, right? And the usage grammar people are talking about templates for idioms and mini sentences and phrases and things like that. So I think both critiques are kind of relevant, actually. And I don't mean to dismiss the usage grammar perspective too much, because of course, this is an empirical question, right? If it turns out that, yes, a lot of these templatic kind of chunky memorized processes are more regularly used in language processing, then that's an important thing for linguists to know about, because that will help us narrow down precisely when we would expect to see signature of syntax. So one of the issues that we've had in literature is, as you probably know, it's hard to find neural signatures of syntax. And the reason why might be for the concerns that the usage grammar people point out, right? Maybe they're right. Maybe when you do podcast listening and you do naturalistic storybook, tasks with people in fMRI and MEG and intracranial tasks, maybe that's why it's hard to kind of expose unique signatures of syntax above and beyond the statistics of like lexical processing, right? Because when you do that sort of naturalistic stuff, you do just rely on those sorts of templates. That's possible. I wouldn't count on it. I don't really think that's true myself, which is also why I'm keen on doing these more carefully controlled and designed old-fashioned cognitive science tasks, right, where you carefully design the materials and you know exactly what you're kind of looking at when you see the effect. But no, that's kind of what I would say just in general. I think some of these critiques from the usage-based people, like, for example, the idea that language processing is like resource-bound and biased and all the active inference concerns come in here at the same time, right? All those things are completely true. But I just don't think it is much of a threat to the idea that the human brain also builds structures recursively using this kind of merge-based operator, or whatever you want to call it, right? You can frame it in the ways that I mentioned. I just don't think it's as much of a threat to that theory as some people think, right? A lot of people think that these usage-based complaints are like a serious threat to the idea that the human brain can build, phrase structures in the way that the generative people would argue for. I don't see it as much of a threat as they do. So it's kind of it's not really a disagreement on the force of it's a disagreement on the force of the claim rather than the kind of empirical possibility that it is an empirical possibility that people rely on this kind of template schema. In fact, even people like Peter Hagot, right? In Peter Hagot's earlier work, he talks about in his MUC model, right, the memory unification control model, even he's very clear that yes, something like unification or merge is happening, but we may, of course, rely on these like treelets, like little memorized schemas for syntactic structures that are probably just, there since childhood. So that's a total possibility as well. So I'm not committed to the claim, and I say this in both of my Rose papers very clearly. I'm not committed to the idea that it's completely implausible to say that every time we do some language-related process, that the full slew of linguistic creativity from phoneme all the way up to phrase structure is being triggered and driven. It depends on the instant, and this is why the question about the social linguistic question I think is quite an interesting one, because that will also modify the occurrence of these processes as well, right? Yeah. Anyway, I don't know if anybody else wants to chip in, or if Sander wants to chip in as well. But yeah, please.
I think I've said everything. That's good.
Okay, sweet. Well, yeah, thank you very much for joining in, man. Very nice to meet you as well in person, almost.
Definitely.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you for coming, guys. I guess we can maybe Sander, do you want to stop the video?
I will do it. Okay, everybody, have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.